Let's get started. Okay.
All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. This is Yawei Liu, hailing from Atlanta. I'm the senior advisor on China at the Carter Center. So we're very fortunate to organize this webinar with the Center for American Studies at Fudan University. Back in 2014, Professor Wu Xinbo, the director of the Center for American Studies, invited President Carter to Fudan University. That was President Carter's last trip to China. It was one of the last two stops in China. After the Fudan event, I think President Carter attended Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce event. And of course, President Carter has always been thinking about China, about the U.S.-China relationship. But today's webinar is not exactly on the bilateral relationship. On the contrary, it is on a very important development in the United States, which is the race relationship, particularly regarding Asian Americans. So I'm going to first invite Professor Wu Xinbo to make opening remarks. Professor Wu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yahweh. Good evening from Shanghai, and welcome to the webinar on a Trans-Pacific perspective of anti-Asian discrimination in the US and its implications. This event is co-organized by the Center for American Studies at Fudan University, China, and the Carter Center in the US. I'm Wu Xinbo, professor and director at the American Studies Center at Fudan. 1 year ago, the murder of Black people, George Floyd, and ensuing Black Lives Matter movement rampant across the United States attested to the deep-rooted and systemic racism in this country. 1 year later, the troubling spike in the hate crime against Asian Americans shows that racism is targeting on new victims. A recent poll from the Associated Press NOC Center for Public Affairs Research finds 60% of Americans say discrimination against Asian Americans has swelled compared with 1 year ago, including 71% of Asian Americans, 66% of Black Americans, 59% of white Americans, and 55% of Hispanic Americans. Nearly half of Americans believe Asian Americans encounter a great deal of or quite a lot of discrimination in the US today. The poll also finds about 6 in 10 Americans say racism in the US in general is a very or extremely serious problem. And a majority of Asian Americans say they feel unsafe in public because of their race. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, Symbolic, found that Asian targeted hate crimes in the largest US cities rose 145% in 2020 compared with 2019, even though hate crimes overall declined 6%. In the fourth quarter of this year, anti-Asian crimes reported to police in 16 major cities and counties jumped 164% from the same time period last year. The webinar today will try to address the following questions. What is driving anti-Asian prejudice in the US? How can this discrimination be understood alongside racism and discrimination towards Asian Americans? What distinguishes these types of racism? What is the role of the model minority myth in anti-Asian and anti-African racism, respectively? How have Asian Americans and African Americans expressed solidarity against racial discrimination in the past? What does solidarity look like in the future? As long as the US and China have a cold and hostile relationship, can anti-Chinese prejudice be effectively mitigated? And finally, can the US and China jointly address anti-Black racism alongside prejudice against Chinese and ethnic minorities? On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank 2 speakers from the US and 5 discussants from China, South Korea, Vietnam, and Singapore. Especially, I want to thank Dr. Yawei Liu from the Carter Center, who has done an excellent job in making this happen. Now, without further ado, let me turn the floor to Yawei, who is going to moderate the following presentation. So Yawei, over to you.
Thanks, Professor Wu. So we have the format of today's webinar is we will have 2 main presentations. One is from Professor Qin Gao from Columbia University, followed by the presentation from Professor Brown from Tennessee State University. So the first one is going to be Qin Gao, a professor of social policy at Columbia University. For details of the bios of the speakers, please click the link at the chat. You'll be able to see the detailed biographies of each and every speakers. Professor Gao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Liu and Professor Wu. It's an honor to join you and my other distinguished panelists. I say hello to everyone who is joining from around the world, from New York. Before I begin, I want to share a little bit of personal experience, history. I came to New York from China 20 years ago. Right away, I fell in love with this vibrant and dynamic city. I think what resonated me the most was the diversity and inclusiveness of this great city. I remember one day, shortly after I arrived in the city to study at Columbia University, walking in Central Park, just looking around to see people of different skin colors, hearing different accents from around the world. I felt I belonged. And only a few days upon arrival, I felt I was a New Yorker. So fast forward 19 years, last year around March, New York became the epicenter of the pandemic in the US. And at that time, my friends, neighbors, colleagues were working together to mobilize resources and bring help from China and the rest of Asia to provide PPEs, protective equipment, other supplies to New York to help our neighborhood, our community to overcome this tragic pandemic. We were aware racism against Asians were starting to increase, but we didn't anticipate the huge spike in the following year. At the same time, my colleagues and I at Columbia University started a survey of New York City residents who are of Chinese origin. So today, it's my great pleasure to share with you some of the findings from our survey. I'm now going to share my screen. So I call the title of my presentation is Double Pandemic. Amid the pandemic, which is COVID, we have Chinese Americans and others who are of Chinese and Asian descent who experience increasing discrimination during the pandemic. I want to thank our research team and funders and study participants who make this possible. So we had this New York City longitudinal survey of well-being starting in 2012, almost a decade ago. And each cohort we follow for 4 years on a quarterly basis, which enables us to capture the well-being and living condition changes of New York City residents. And last summer, we started the 4th cohort to capture the immediate and long-term impacts of COVID-19 in New York City. And because Asians are the fastest growing ethnic group in New York, we wanted to capture this group, but because we didn't have enough funding to capture all the Asian sub-ethnic groups, we started with the Chinese to include as an oversample. So today's presentation is based on the oversample of New Yorkers of Chinese descent, which included about 465 people. I want to share 3 main findings with you. Finding number 1, racism spiked during this pandemic. New Yorkers of Chinese descent experienced high rates and different forms of racial discrimination during the pandemic. So this chart shows 57% of our respondents experienced at least one type of discrimination in everyday life. That's the bar at the bottom. That's counting the 4 different kinds of responses above. So first one, 20% people said they've been threatened or harassed. 30% said they've been treated unfairly at restaurants or stores. 40% said the other people acted as if they were afraid of them. And 43% said they were treated with less respect than other people. If we combine the 4 categories, 57% said they experienced at least one type of this kind of discrimination during everyday life. What forms of discrimination did people experience? The forms varied, but all reflected racism, xenophobia, and exclusion. So at the very end, I think to your, this is left, right? The last bar shows 27% of people said overall they experienced at least one form of discrimination. If we start from the beginning, 18% said people called them a racial slur or harassed them. 13% said they were excluded from activities or events. 12% said someone made a verbal threat. 6% said someone physically intimidated or assaulted you, or someone vandalized your home, car, or property. So when these are combined, 27% said they experienced at least one form of this kind of racism or xenophobia acts. What did people think were the reasons for these experiences? Most attributed such experiences to race, skin color, ancestry, or national origin. We see that 76% of respondents said it's because of my race or skin color. 64% said it's because of my ancestry or national origin. Quite amazingly, 31% said it's because they were wearing a mask, and 2% said because they were not wearing a mask. And this is going to continue going forward. Now in the US, many people have had the vaccine, but then there's mixed reactions about continuing to wear a mask before or after or during the vaccination trends. People also mentioned other reasons that are not captured in the bar chart: speaking with an accent, working in healthcare, coughing or sneezing, and the racist rhetoric in the media, hate crimes, and racial profiling. That's what people mentioned in their narrative responses to our survey. So this chart shows the This chart shows the racial discrimination experiences I showed first by the different racial groups with a larger sample size. So we look at Asians, other or multiracial groups, Hispanics, Blacks, and whites. So the bars in each group is in this order. We see that for overall experience of any of these experiences, Asians had the highest percentage, 53%, followed by 51% Hispanics and 43% Blacks and 49% multiracial people. 38% of whites said they experienced any of these forms of racial discrimination. So this is finding number 1, racism spiked against people of Chinese descent and Asians during the pandemic. Finding number 2, as is well known, and I think Professor Brown will speak to this, racism hurt. The racial discrimination experienced by New Yorkers of Chinese descent led to high levels of stress and vigilance. This chart shows people's reported levels of anticipatory stress and vigilance in 3 measures. The first one at the top, people felt uneasy in public areas or worried about how other people might look at you, 61%. 65% said they tried to avoid certain social situations or places due to worries about racial discrimination. And 70% said they worried about their families and their own safety from hate crime or harassment. So these are very high percentages of stress and vigilance. When we ask people to elaborate how they feel about this, the most frequent term or phrase mentioned is on tenterhooks. In Chinese, 提心吊胆, which captures this feeling very well. People say they felt lots of pressure and fear. They were very worried when going out. They were afraid of being attacked if going out, so they stayed home and felt depressed. And they were on tenterhooks every day, fearful of racial discrimination. The New Yorker featured Asians, I think, which never happened before, for the first time on their cover. And it's this image that captures a mother with a young child on tenterhooks, looking around to see whether they are safe. This really resonates with me because after about 1 year of the pandemic, my son said to me, "Mom, I miss New York City subway. I want to ride the subway." And I had to explain to him that it's okay, we will do it, but it could be something might happen. And we, again, will be okay. This is what we're going to do to try to prepare. It is quite, on a personal level, quite a profound moment. At the same time, when I had the conversation with my son, I realized Black mothers have this conversation with their children, especially their sons, for a long, long time. And it only is happening to me for the first time. So it reminded me the profound racism toward Black Americans, people of other race ethnicities that existed long before the pandemic exacerbated racism toward Asians. It's not that racism toward Asians didn't exist before, but it probably didn't exist in this kind of overt and physical assault forms in the public. So how did people cope? 92% of people in our study responded. They used passive coping strategies. So I used blue to show these different coping strategies. They accepted it as a fact of life, 68%. They said they try to forget about what happened, 66%. They try to keep the feeling to themselves, not talking to anyone, 56%, and 8% blame themselves, said they felt they brought it on themselves. Some people also used active coping strategies, 80% in total. So 67% said they talked to someone about their feelings. 43% said they prayed or sought spiritual support. 40% said they sought advice on how to deal with the issue. 33% verbally protested or tried to reason with the offender. 30% said they expressed anger to let off steam. And honestly, my friends and I, my family and I have discussed all these coping strategies and used quite many of these. The last finding I want to share with you is for some people within our study, it's not only a double pandemic, it's a triple pandemic. New Yorkers of Chinese descent who had material hardships, poverty, and other challenges were more likely to experience racial discrimination and had more related stress than those without material hardships. So this picture shows 29% of New Yorkers of Chinese descent had material hardships from paying bills, having enough food, financial reasons, housing, and medical, which was the highest percentage, 16%. In this graph, I show in blue bars, those without material hardships, and in yellow bars, those with material hardships. We see that across these different racial discrimination experiences, those with material hardships consistently had higher experiences of racial discrimination. The first set of bars is overall experience, and then the other 4 bars are different types of racial experiences. So those who are suffering from material hardships are more likely to experience discrimination. And they also had greater stress and vigilance. Similar patterns, the yellow bars are higher than the blue bars because they felt they were more stressed and had to be more vigilant than the ones without material hardship. Both bars are very high, but this shows the gap between the material deprivation and also racial discrimination and stress. We ask people exactly how they feel. Some people say they are disheartened. The racial divide in this country upsets me greatly. I'm terrified by the racial and political division in our country. Some still try to stay hopeful. I feel dispowered in the US, so I choose to stay silent. But I have hope that things will get better in the future. I believe the relationship between different racial groups will get better with better leadership. And then I think about how America is a country that has lost its way and lost respect for its people. But I also think about the American people who have come together to demand equality and racial justice. So I'm happy to end on this relatively hopeful note. This is artwork titled, "I Still Believe in Our City," this great city of New York, created by an artist in residence with the New York City Commission on Human Rights and a daughter of immigrants, to show Asians and Blacks in solidarity, and we are not going to walk away. We are not going to be feared into hiding. We are going to unite and keep fighting and claim that this is our city too. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Gao. I think that's a brilliant presentation. It's a very detailed survey work. And I think you end your presentation on a very hopeful note. Not only Americans living in New York City still believe in the city. I think majority of the Americans still believe that this country is capable of correcting its problems and gaining what it used to be at the global stage. So next, we're going to go to Professor Brown from the Tennessee State University. Professor Brown, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Leo. Thank you to the Carter Center, to Fudan University, and everyone who organized this particular panel. It's my great honor to be here with you this morning. I am currently located in Nashville, Tennessee, so greetings from the Music City. As mentioned, I'm a professor of history here at Tennessee State University, historically Black College University, one of 3 in the city of Nashville. So good morning and welcome to everyone. My background is primarily, I am a Chinese historian. I'm a sinologist by training, but my research very much looks into questions about race, ethnicity, and what I also call networks of difference within Sino-Black relations. And so today I want to think about, in the title of our event, thinking through trans-Pacific perspective. So thinking about the global and how the global and the national in some ways impact each other as well. And so kind of thinking through a global perspective and how we can think about this in terms of strengthening our domestic relationships, addressing these questions in the domestic space, but also how there is a global connection and a global concern and how we think about these particular moments as well. So as a historian, I'm going to provide somewhat of a historical perspective. So I hope you all can stay with me. I'm going to try to do a lot in 20 minutes. So apologies. I hope to make sure I cover as much as possible, but if I don't cover it, please feel free to ask these comments and please ask questions in the comments, because the goal is to in some ways elicit conversation, to in some ways get the motors going, if you will, so that we can have a lot of discussion. So I will try to cover as much as possible and build upon the amazing presentation that was given in terms of thinking about the studies and research as it relates to racism and the kind of different ways in which it's impacting all of us in the COVID, especially thinking about the heightened incidence of anti-Asian discrimination, thinking about also the beginning of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, and how all this in some ways is connected to a larger historical narrative that we need to underpin and kind of undertake to really get to the question of how do we in some ways really interrogate, really in some ways start to dismantle some of these histories and some of these false narratives, and how we can think about moving forward in terms of solidarity, moving forward in terms of on a hopeful note, hopefully on a hopeful note as well. So that's the goal, to think about bringing some kind of hope and positivity as we think about these conversations. So I'll share my brief PowerPoint. Is not too much. It's mostly mostly resources to share, but there are a few things I will share as well. Let me see if I can share screen. So I want to begin with just a few terms and concepts and then thinking about historical perspectives. And so again, as I mentioned, my background is Chinese history. So I'm going to frame this a little bit in terms of thinking about U.S.-China relationships, because in many cases, if you've been keeping, in terms of abreast of the news, in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, the talks, ongoing conversations, the question about human rights issues, and in particular thinking about race has been mentioned by both sides of the conversation. And so in thinking about the U.S.-China relationship, the question about race as it pertains as a human rights issue is what has come up quite a bit. And so thinking about this in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, thinking about it kind of historically, thinking about the Mao era, which is my area of specialization, but also thinking about it in terms of the contemporary moment, and then thinking about how domestic issues are also global concerns, thinking about the ways in which what's happening in domestic space also has a resonance on the global stage and vice versa. And also thinking about movements of solidarity moving forward. And I put question mark, not to in some ways mean that it's a negative, but thinking about question mark in terms of what can we all do to some ways with our own individual, but also institutional goals that we can do to kind of move forward and thinking about solidarity moving forward in terms of addressing these questions and concerns. So there's a few terms. I know we use these terms quite a bit, but I want to think about these and how we talk about them and kind of have a working definition amongst ourselves. When we have a discussion, we are all in some ways agreement of what we're discussing. And so these are terms, just the basic definition from Webster. I wanted to put them up there so we kind of have an idea of when we say solidarity, what does that mean? Allyship. These are terms that are thrown out quite a bit, but what do we mean by those? And how do we now know what they mean when we get to the discussion about solidarity? What does that mean in terms of actions for us, again, as individuals, but also as institutions? Also thinking about anti-Blackness, what that means as a term, and also thinking through the idea of the Trans-Pacific. So I want to focus on these last two that are not up here. Thinking about the idea of anti-Blackness, and this is something that Dr. Ross in her New York Times piece does very eloquently discuss, and that link is in the last two slides of this PowerPoint, in additional readings and resources, where she discusses how there are multiple forms of racism, as we learned about in the previous presentation, how racism is a form of discrimination that can cut across different identity markers. It can be along the lines of race, along the lines of gender, also along the lines of sexuality. There are ways in which race, the thing about discrimination, how racism is one of those forms of discrimination as it goes across the lines of race specifically. There's also one where Ross mentions in her piece where anti-Blackness is one, it's a form of racism that is very specific to the ways in which it pertains to people who identify as Black or who in some ways are designated as Black. So sometimes it can be a self-identity, or in some cases, in certain spaces, how someone is defined in terms of how their identity is ascribed. Someone ascribes identity to them, and it's a form of identity, a form of racism and discrimination that is specific to those who are in that particular category of Black, and how that in some ways leads to how we see global anti-Blackness in different places, where it's not just racism, but it can be anti-Blackness and how that looks in different places. And also thinking about the Trans-Pacific. I'm working on a piece now, and in a particular piece where we're looking at thinking about the Trans-Pacific as not just a space in terms of thinking about diasporic connections, thinking about the Trans-Pacific in terms of different movements and people, as well as cultures and ideas, how that leads to this kind of creation of different identities, but also thinking about the Trans-Pacific as some ways a problematizing methodology, how we can think about the Trans-Pacific as a means to, in some ways, amplify discourses that fall sometimes through the crack of traditional disciplinary divides. So we think about historical narratives, we think about certain disciplines, how in many cases, sometimes these narratives get lost. And the reason why I bring up these last two is because we're talking about what's happening in our current moment. People are asking, well, how did we get here? What happened? We learn from a lot of historical narratives, what happened is not new, unfortunately. There's historical precedents for what's happening and what's going on in these different discourses. There's a great video I wanted to kind of think about. It's called Far East, Deep South. It's on PBS. And I will say PBS has done a lot of great things in trying to bring awareness. They have a lot of video shorts and things where they're talking about some of these narratives that have been circulating. But this is a video, it's a family's kind of documentary where the father and his parents his grandfather and his father have roots in Mississippi. There is a contingency, there's a whole community of people who have Chinese descent who are born and raised and have been in Mississippi for generations. When we think about Mississippi, we think about very much Black and white. We don't think about any other kind of categories because in many places in the South, that's in many cases how the divide is in some ways talked about. We think about cities, kind of cosmopolitan cities like New York, and I lived in LA for a little bit. We don't have that same kind of feeling, but I grew up in Atlanta. I'm a Georgia girl. And so I understand in some ways how we think about the South is very much in terms of Black and white, but what happens when you're neither one of those categories? How do you just construct identity in a very polarized society, and what does that mean for individuals in that particular space? And so I bring that particular film up because one, it illuminates in many cases these diasporic connection, illuminates thinking about the Trans-Pacific in terms of the coolie trade, how some of these individuals made their way to the United States. That was not the only way that Chinese immigrants came to the US, but that was one way, especially in the Deep South, as Chinese laborers were specifically recruited from many places in Southern China to come to the Deep South to replace what used to be slave labor. So they abolished slavery. You still have an agriculture-based society. How do we bring in laborers, and what does this mean for the society? And so there's actually a lot of scholarship that is coming out that talks about, in many cases, the intention of many Southern planters, that kind of a planter class post-emancipation, where they're going to places in Southern China, and they're actually actively bringing in coolie labor. There was actually a conference that was held in Memphis. It was actually in about 1860 and 1869. And it very much discusses the convention of this kind of 1%, this kind of planter class of setting up a joint stock company specifically to be put in Memphis, because Memphis is on the Mississippi River. It's not too far from the Port of New Orleans, which is where they were bringing in the labor. They were in some ways trying to cut off the Spanish connection to us. They were trying to cut off the Caribbean in the ways in which they were limiting coolie labor coming to the US. They built their own connection between New Orleans and Southern China, and how this was very much intentional. And so thinking about this connection, again, thinking about how in some ways people get to places, the concept of thinking through the ideas of what does that mean for these individuals who are bought? And I bring up the coolie labor because in the discussions and the writings about this labor pool that was being recruited, the question of citizenship was never brought up. The idea of they were never going to be seen as citizens. They're going to come, be a labor source, work for a contracted time period, and then leave and go back to China or go elsewhere, never thinking that these individuals might actually want to stay in the US. So the question of what does it mean to bring in labor, you want to exploit the labor, but not think about the individual and what does that mean. And the way they're writing about the Chinese laborers is very interesting, where a lot of the language they use to describe or to kind of uphold or kind of some ways kind of support the narrative of why Blacks need to be enslaved, where they're happy, they're docile, they're complacent, this kind of language that in some ways very much illuminates to what they wanted from the workers, and in some ways takes away their agency and their subjectivity. But what happens is we see by the Chinese Exclusion Act by 1882, this labor force that was bought in, these laborers that was specifically recruited, now in some ways are being targeted by exclusion, by a federal law that mandates that no longer can come into the United States. So how do we switch from 1868, 1869, where you're having this conference that is specifically targeting or trying to recruit Chinese laborers, a very well-funded, because the expedition was funded. Some of the individuals put, they had about at least $250,000 back in 1868 money that was supporting this invention, this supporting this that was supporting this kind of joint stock invention, where they were going to set up ports, they were going to send money to get people to go there. So again, what happens in that moment? And it comes to the question of citizenship. Who in some ways has access to the rights and privilege of what it means to be a citizen in a country. And so thinking about and thinking through the moments of what happens in terms of solidarity in different groups, compared to racialization is one that comes up quite a bit. And so quite a few scholars such as Ed Lee Wong and others have written on the question of the means of how citizenship in the US specifically, this question of who can belong and who cannot, was very much used against people of color, specifically thinking about African Americans and Asian Americans. So idea of who can be included We think about not only the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also those who were not able to entry, but also what it meant for those who were already in the U.S., having to have your papers, having to in some ways have restricted travel between going back and forth between other places where I think the documentary on PBS, the one that talks about Asian American history, the 3-part series discusses where people who had lived here leave, go home, come back, and cannot get re-entry because in some ways to how the domestic discourse has changed as it relates to what happened in that particular moment. And so thinking through this question of comparative racialization, how in many cases the idea of who can be citizens and who cannot goes back to the foundations and the core of thinking about the United States itself, thinking about the Constitution, those who are eligible for citizenship early on, and what does that mean? And how we in some ways still see this idea of who belongs, and this question of belonging. What does it mean to be American? This kind of singular idea of Americanness, how that some way still in some ways replicates these patterns of comparative racialization, pitting different groups against each other for the idea of citizenship. And so how do we in some ways get beyond this myth or narrative that there's only one way of belonging, there's only one form of Americanness? How do we in some ways confront some of the ways in which American identity has been constructed or has become synonymous with thinking about white American identity? And so what I do in my own research, I try to do 2 things: is 1, address anti-Blackness, but 2, also decenter whiteness, which comes from critical race theory and critical race scholarship. And when we think about decentering whiteness, what it does is that we're not recentering anyone else, but we're doing is that we're taking away this idea that the idea of what it means to be white or akin to whiteness is in some ways what it means to be the only ideal. When we take away and think about moving and beyond whiteness, how do we open up historical narratives that allow us to see in some ways a fuller picture of different perspectives? So for instance, in my research of the Cold War, thinking about historical perspectives, I look at African Americans who go to China during the Maoist period. Specifically, I focus on 1949 to 1972. And in many cases, the way we talk about the Cold War narrative in the U.S. history, it's, U.S.-China, we're not engaging with China, China is communist, the kind of traditional tropes that, we're in some ways at odds with each other. But in many cases, that's not the complete picture. We kind of go beyond this kind of particular narrative, especially as it centers around who can and could not travel, who thinking about who is and who's not American, and in some ways expands to thinking about the ways in which China in 1940s, 50s, and 60s was actively engaging and reaching out to African Americans as a means of thinking about these questions of solidarity. Now, what does it mean? They're still kind of thinking through those questions because Mao does write 2 speeches, one on 1963 on the eve of the March on Washington, and also one in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King about supporting African Americans. That's parts of that speech and part of that language is here in the image in the middle. This is the propaganda poster that comes out in 1967, I believe. And so again, this idea of what Mao is saying, and how in some ways he's reaching out to think about ideas of supporting African Americans in their just struggle against American, he frames it as American imperialism. And the pictures that are flanking this particular propaganda poster are of 2 African Americans who actually do go to China in this period. The far left is Robert F. Williams and his wife. His wife is not pictured, but his wife and their 2 sons go. They're fleeing the United States. They go to Cuba and then make their way to China, and they live there for a period of years in the 1960s. And then also on the far right is W.E.B. Du Bois and his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, on one of their many trips to China. Their first trip to the PRC in 1959, and then subsequent trips until his death in 1963. And she continues to go after his death until her death in 1977. And so they build relationships. And so I bring up these 2 individuals because they're part of it. And think about this moment, the Bandung moment of 1955, this kind of Afro-Asian solidarity that comes out of this post-colonial moment where you have these different individuals and movements that are very much engaged in what does it mean to kind of have colored solidarity globally? What does it mean to have this idea of what it can look like where different nations, where the majority of people, citizens, where the majority of people in power are people of color, how you broadly define that, and how we can think about this in terms of a global scope as well. And so how we see this in some ways in action in the case of the ways in which there's outreach, where these individuals are going to China, not only going to China, but they're also writing about it, and they're writing about their experiences and what does it mean, how they're thinking about this as well. And Robin Kelly, in his book Freedom Dreams, has a really great chapter where he talks about, where the East is, think about China as this space of liberation. This idea, also thinking about what does it mean for China to be this idea of possibility for African Americans. Think about ideology in terms of how can we think about different ideologies beyond the domestic space, because domestically what was happening is, in many cases, we know about the long historical ways in which African Americans, from slavery to emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow era, even post-Jim Crow, even the Great Migration, how we have moments of systemic racism where it's institutionalized, where it's not just overt acts of racism, but it's institutionalized in terms of where people can live, people can go to be educated, how we think about institutions that as well. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I work at a historically Black college university. I also work at a university where it's not only HBCU, but it's a land grant institution. If you look at many states, especially those in the Southeast, you have multiple land grant institutions. In the state of Tennessee, we have two, University of Tennessee and TSU. Why? There's something called the Morrill Act, MORRILL Act, where initially it established land grant institutions were supposed to be a federal mandate that was mediated out by the states, where it should be an education that's supposed to be one that had an agricultural component to it, but also had a general education kind of humanities component, and it was open for anyone. Unfortunately, many states in the South, especially the former Confederate states, when this law was passed in the late 1880s, they were not admitting African Americans. And so we had to have a second Morrill Act in the 1890s to, in some ways, of change and allow to where it was either going to be you uphold separate but equal, or you admit African Americans. And so the idea was we were going to have separate but equal. And so I mentioned this to say, even in our institutions, how in many cases we think about the ways in which race functions, it's not just always the overt acts, but it's also the systemic ways in which different people and have been in some ways excluded. And so if we look at these moments, where I think this current moment right now is showing us in the ways in which the hostilities, the overt acts, where as someone who's from Atlanta, I was appalled to read about and hear about the mass shooting in what happened earlier this year in March, on March 16th, where you have 8 individuals, 6 of which who are women who are of Asian descent, who were killed for nothing but just existing, for in some ways existing and doing what they do every day. And so again, to know that these overt acts are happening, to know that how do we get here? There is a history of where these attitudes in some ways have always been there, but how in many cases the ways in which the local, the global, but also thinking about in some ways the domestic, how the pandemic put pressures on people, how in some ways the administration that was in some ways in charge or in leadership when the pandemic happened, the language that was used, how seeing things such as the Chinese virus or Kung flu, how those were in some ways extremely harmful. It was not just words, but words have powers, words have meaning, and those words tap into long-standing histories of, in some ways, discrimination with the United States. You think about the campaign behind the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did not come about as a result of just people did not want to have neighbors who were of Chinese descent. There was in some ways targeted campaign with propaganda posters and language, the same ways we see the lynching and the lynching laws that were happening in kind of Jim Crow legislation. And so I want to end on thinking about there is a history there. There is a history where there is a history of hate, history of violence, but I don't want the solidarity to be built on, we all have a history of pain. I want us to think about building a solidarity moving forward on the legacies of those who have done the bridge building. And so here is the image. It's been in some ways, a lot of young people have been tapping back into Yuri Kusiyama and also Grace Lee Boggs and others who are activists who were doing this work decades ago, who were tapping into thinking about cross-racial solidarity and movements. And so I want us to think about tapping into these legacies. We're thinking about solidarity. How do we move forward and thinking through what does it mean to build cross-racial solidarity networks, organizations, using these historical models to say, yes, there is a past, but there's also a past of hope that we can build upon, and thinking about activism and getting involved. And so I hope that as we continue to see legislation being passed, that in some ways is saying this is not okay, this is illegal, as we're seeing in some ways this year, as in June, when we're talking about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, where people are talking about this, where we have people, individuals who are survivors testifying in Congress to say we need to have more anti-hate legislation being passed because these things are happening. And if we in some ways start to tackle the ways in which these overt acts are happening, we also need to start tackling the systemic ways in which these attitudes have been supported, buttressed, and in some ways be able to be ossified within the American system. So in some ways putting pressure, keeping the pressure going, and keeping this momentum going to think about the ways in which we can talk about and engage in how we can support each other, different groups, and thinking about what we can do to move forward and really make diversity, equity, inclusion not just be a statement of the moment, but actually be a reality in our own individual communities, institutions, and also amongst ourselves. Thank you. And here's just the last few slides that are just additional resources, and I'm happy to share this as well. These are additional readings that come out, and one of which this came out recently through NPR. Well, yesterday was the idea of dismantling the trope of Asian Americans as a model minority. And it really gets into thinking about identity and breaking down the idea of a monolith, where we talk about these groups in these big categories, breaking it down and think about diversity among these different groups. What does that mean across the board? And has a lot of great data that goes along with that. Also, a few of the books I like to read and talk about and discuss myself as well. And then also thinking about additional resources, different organizations, institutions, one of which is the Black China Caucus, a nonprofit I co-founded that in some ways tries to amplify Black professional voices in the China space. And last but not least is the Far East Deep South film that I mentioned from PBS. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Brown. You packed so much into your 20 minutes presentation. I'm pretty sure there'll be a lot of questions from our discussion as well as the audience. But they're going to hold their questions for now. So we're going to move to the second part of today's webinar. That is, we're going to hear from 5 scholars on different perspectives of this anti-Asian American syndrome in the United States. So our first discussant is Chongyue Wang. She's Assistant Research Professor at the Institute of American Studies, CAS. Chongyue, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Liu, for your introductions, and I'm really glad to participate in this webinar. And I have enjoyed 2 very interesting and enlightening presentations about race and about the ethnic relations. And from Professor Gao's presentation, she has shared very detailed survey findings about the Chinese descent, especially the discrimination rate or forms, and what the people thought of the reason and the comparison among different ethnic groups. I mean, the statistics comparison, and also the hurts and damage, and a lot of details during the pandemic. I have learned a lot from that. And also for the Professor Brown, and she has her presentation has a more global perspective, and also according to the historical information and current perspective. And also it has a background of the U.S.-China relationships to talk about the solidarities between African American and Chinese. I think this topic is very meaningful, and it really means a lot for the world, for the whole world, and for the future. Thanks a lot. And those 2 thought-provoking presentations just make me think about one question, that is, what's the root cause for the intensifications of racial conflicts in American society right now? And no matter for the Floyd's death or the surge in violence against the Asian Americans, maybe the identity or ethnicity seems to be the trigger. However, I don't think this is the key to the answer, because the concept of the ethnicity has a very long history, and it is not always related to the hostility and hatred. So as far as we all know, ever since its founding, the U.S. has been a multi-ethnic societies, and the immigrants from different parts of the world, they just set foot on American mainland from different parts of the times, and they just try to break away from their original nationalities, original customs, culture, habits, and the political systems, and try to form what the Krefelcourt called a new man in his famous book, Letters from an American Letters. So although we know that there are some inherent fragilities and contradictions within the multi-ethnic societies, but I think U.S. has its own formula that is try to organize the immigrants to the civic participation so as to encourage them to taking active part in the government of societies. And by doing so is try to break away from those immigrants' old loyalties and to establish the new national identities, and so as to integrate or even transcend the multi-ethnic differences and enrich and reshape the common culture. So if we just looking back to the history of American, we can find that no matter for the Civil War or the civil rights movements, the struggle for the equal rights of ethnic minorities have never been stopped. But generally speaking, I think those movements, no matter from the purpose or the process, can be regarded as or can be evaluated as positive because they have made significant contribution to the economic strength, societal resilience, and cultural vibrancies for the American society. However, why is the struggle become a racial animosities in which turn out to be splitting the American consensus today? So in order to answer these questions, I think we can see that for the development of American societies, it is necessary to coordinate and contain three forces. That is the political force, capital force, and social force. And if we see American society right now, we can find that the political force and the capital forces are changing from coordinations to conflict. And the regional state between the political forces and social forces is the mutual checks and balance, and the complementarities are turning out to be mainly confrontations. And just like what Carl Polanyi said, the self-regulating markets are not spontaneous, they are just politically constructed, which means that economy is just embedded within the society. If it not do so, if it is unembedded from the societies, the society will produce the destructive forces that is called the counter movement, and so as to protect the society itself. So according to this framework, I think the racial-related hate crimes and the anti-racial movements nowadays are just a manifestation for the imbalance of those three forces which I have mentioned above, and also also the manifestation for the weakening of the social forces. And if we just looking through the social forces in American nowadays, we can see that it is undergoing triple changes. The first changes is that the social forces are becoming more privileged. We can see it in two perspectives. And first, on one hand, we can see that in the social structures of American society has been changing from the healthy olive-shaped to the pyramid structures or even the double diamond structures, which means that both the high income and low income groups are facing the internal redifferentiations, and the middle class, which means a lot for the stability of the societies, is shrinking seriously. And on the other hand, I think the privilege of social forces also can be seen directly reflected in the severity of the COVID-19 through the class scissors gap. And we can find that both the rural areas and the non-white populations, they have got very high infections rate and mortality rate. And this is partially because they are poor medical infrastructures conditions, and there are more possibility to be out of insurance, and most of them are engaged in the low pay jobs which cannot ask for day leave with pay, or just working remotely during the most serious time in the pandemic. The second change, I think, is the social forces is becoming increasingly fragmented. And the traditional basis of social forces is justice, consensus, and a good order. And right now it was broken by the tendency of tribalism, which emphasize opposition. And those kind of opposition just become general differences, just ran through all kinds of that's hot topic in the society, like illegal immigrations, abortions, gun control, legalization of marijuana, and etc. And also during the repeated rebounders in the COVID-19, the many chaos in the societies like gun violence, hate crimes, and opium crisis have been gaining momentum. And especially it was triggered by the polarization of the party and by the red and blue confrontations in the 2020 presidential presidential elections, and which has posed a severe challenge to the public power. This is the second change. And the third change, I think, is multiple ideological trends just push the social forces to the edge of irrationality. And according to a lot of statistics, but from Gallup or from Pews, we can find that the number of white nationalist hate groups rose by 55% during the Trump presidency, and also during the COVID-19 pandemics. And the white supremacists thought it was a very good chance for them to recruit and arm so that they're more active than before. And as the counteractions of these thought tendencies, the Black nationalism is still on rise, which is also triggered by the death of Floyd. And a lot of people just carried out an anti-police violence and protest and anti-racist movements in the name of Black Lives Matter. And some of them within this movement, they are just extremists and just try to disturb the social order under the cover of anti-racist slogan. So according to the Homeland Security, according to the Homeland Security Threat Assessment Report in 2020, the violent extremists motivated by race and ethnicity have been regarded as the most persistent and lethal threats in America up till now. So here comes my very short conclusions. I think through the very roughly observation of the changes of American social forces, we can see that the ethnicity is strengthened in the conflict of those three forces I've mentioned above, and the hostility within ethnicity is not formed naturally. It is appeared only when there are mandatory boundaries, exclusive politics, or the need for ethnic minorities to form alliance. So that's what I want to say. Thank you a lot.
I can't hear you, Professor Liu.
Sorry. Thanks, Chongyue, for your presentation. We're going to move on to our second speaker, discussant, Professor Shang Ha from Sogang University. Professor Ha actually got his PhD from University of Chicago, and then taught at New York, two cities where race relationship is actually, sort of the reflection of what Chongyue just mentioned, this conflict between the white and the Black, and now with other ethnic groups in the mix. So Professor Ha.
Okay, thank you. So I have a few slides to share with you. So could you allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, let me give you the co-host. Yeah, you can share now.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you for inviting me for this wonderful the webinar, and the timely and is very important. And then I always say that tell my students that the race and ethnic politics and race and ethnic issues are very new and to our students in South Korea, because as most of you already know, the South Korea is the exceptionally the racial and the ethnically homogeneous. So we don't have any ideas, how to deal with the racial and ethnic diversity. That the most countries actually have experienced for a long time. All right, so for preparing for my the discussion, I tried to answer the questions the Professor Liu and Professor Wu included in the meeting agenda. Okay, so they sent us the meeting agenda, and then the agenda included the several questions, important. Mostly unanswerable questions, I would say, but I tried to give some of my ideas. To try to answer those questions. Okay. So first question is, what is driving anti-Asian prejudice in the United States? So of course, there's a long history of the discrimination against the Asian Americans. Dated back to the late 19th century. But the current the interest and the current attention to anti-Asian prejudice and discrimination in the United States, it's needless to say, it's based on the Americans' perception of the COVID-19. They blame the China on the spread of COVID-19. There's no doubt about it. But the second question is, So how can this discrimination be understood alongside the racism and discrimination towards Black and African Americans? It's a very important question, but I think, there is a convincing answer, okay, to this question, which is proposed by Professor Claire Chin Kim, the University of Irvine, the Political Science Department. In 1999, she wrote an article titled The Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans. So where she argued that the discrimination against African Americans is fundamentally different from discrimination against Asian Americans. Okay? And then the discrimination against the Black Americans is basically hierarchical. So it's the white Americans is above, and then Black Americans are located below. And then both the white Americans and Black Americans are considered the insiders. That's the point. But conversely, discrimination against Asian Americans are based on the outsider image. Okay, so they are naturally insider. Okay? They are naturally insider to the United States. So that means when something happens to Asian Americans, both the white Americans and Black Americans can say them, go back to your country. Okay? So go back to your country. That kind of discrimination cannot be found, okay, against the Black Americans because they are already insiders. Okay, so this kind of the triangular relationship is arguably the most important, the framework, okay, with which we can deal with the complex relations among the 3 or 4 different types of races, racial groups in the United States. That's a key difference. And what I would like to emphasize here, the modern minority myth. Okay, so question is, so what distinguishes these types of racism? So what is the role of modern anti-Black racism respectively? Okay, so modern minority, I think, this is a myth, and then most the sociologists and political scientists consider modern minority theory is a myth. There are 3 reasons. First of them, is the modern minority okay, so on average, than African Americans, but there's a clear the heterogeneity Americans social status. Okay, that's the first thing, and then the modern minority myth is based on the symbolic racism against African Americans by whites. Okay? And then the third myth regarding modern minority theory is it is for some reason fully embraced by Asian Americans as a part of American dream for them. Okay, there are some numbers here. So like I said, on average, the median income of Asian Americans are higher than median incomes of other races in the United States, noticeably higher than household income of African Americans. That's probably the basis of the modern minority theory, I would say. But when we unpack the socioeconomic status of Asian Americans across ethnic groups, so we can see this difference. So Asian Indians, okay, their median household income is really high, but there are other Asian groups whose median household income level is relatively low. For example, the Laotians, Thai, Cambodian, Hmong. Okay, we cannot call them as the socioeconomically the better than the African American or Hispanics. Okay. Also for the educational level, it's the same. So on average, Asian Americans, their level of educational attainment is relatively high, higher than other racial groups in the United States. But there is a diversity within Asian American communities. Okay. So modern minority theory focuses on the top. But when we see the bottom, of the educational attainment level or the median household income level of the Asian Americans, so we cannot say that the modern minority theory is the convincing. Okay, and then the measures of symbolic racism. So modern minority theory is also related to symbolic racism, okay, vis-a-vis blatant or old-fashioned racism. Okay, in public opinion polls, the first question is a typical question that intended to measure the symbolic racism, okay, among people. So, and other ethnic groups, okay, overcame prejudice and worked their way. So should the same with any special favor. Okay, so that means, okay, Asian Americans, okay, they were discriminated, okay, but they were successfully gained higher socioeconomic status. I mean, blacks should do the same. Okay, this is symbolic rather than blatant racism. So because this question, it doesn't ask people to evaluate the intelligence level of blacks or work ethic of the blacks, okay, but it indirectly, okay, try to persuade the blacks to work hard. And so this kind of idea is shared by a lot of scholars in Asian American community. So one typical example is Amy Chua, the law professor at Yale University. Okay, she and her husband wrote this book, The Triple Package, a few years ago, several years ago, I would say. The basic question of this book is, so why the Asians perform well in the United States and perform better than Latinos, the Hispanics or African Americans? I mean, that is the question. And then they try to find the answer by focusing on three cultural traits. I mean, this is a cultural determinism, unfortunately. Yeah. So even though, I mean, the message of this book is nuanced, but the main message of this book can be easily misunderstood. Okay, simply, oh, this book says that, okay, Asians are better than African Americans because they work hard. They work harder than African Americans. Okay, so modern minority, I mean, that works because the Asian Americans, I mean, deserve a higher level of socioeconomic status than blacks because we work hard. You know, we have, I mean, better cultural trait. Okay, so that is obviously a misunderstanding. Okay, but book like this, okay, they actually contributed to the amplification of that kind of misunderstanding among the Americans, and especially among Asian Americans, I would say. Okay, and then the next question, so how have Asian Americans and African Americans expressed solidarity against racial discriminations in the past, and what does the solidarity look like in the future? Just the data gathered by sociologists in Columbia University. So from the Asian survey conducted last year. And then so the data shows us the perception of discrimination against Black people, okay, among Asian Americans. Okay. As you can easily see, most Asians living in the United States think that the discrimination against the Black people is serious, okay? But there's a noticeable disparity, okay, across ethnic groups among Asian Americans. I mean, for example, the Chinese and Vietnamese, they are less likely to think that there is the serious discrimination against Black, okay, than the Koreans and Indians in the United States, I think. Okay, this is a difficult question. So how, as long as the United States and China have a cold or hostile relationship, can anti-Chinese prejudice be effectively mitigated? I'm not sure. So this is, I don't have a clear answer to this question. But okay, but when I see this question, so I ask myself, I mean, can ordinary Americans distinguish Chinese Americans from Korean, Japanese, or Vietnamese Americans, okay, in everyday life? Okay. I'm asking this question because, okay, this is embarrassing. I mean, there's an unfortunate incident that happened the last month. the Korean American. Then she said, okay, I don't want them is Chinese Americans. I mean, they here at all. Okay, Kim, who is a Korean American, told attendees, let's speak of Chinese immigrants and China in general. And then Dallas Morning News report. And they steal our intellectual property. They give us the coronavirus. They don't hold themselves accountable. Okay, so she, as a Korean American, okay, criticize Chinese Americans. But my question is, if she, Sally Kim, walks on the street, can Americans consider her as Korean Americans or Asian Americans? I mean, as far as I know, no one distinguishes Korean Americans from Chinese Americans. They are just Asian Americans. I mean, racial identity is an identity imposed by society. But still, the Koreans, okay, so there's a tension between ethnic groups, different ethnic groups within the Asian Americans that then may cause some trouble to mitigate the Asian American relations or Black Asian American relations in the future. The last question, the most difficult question. So can the United States and China jointly address anti-Black racism alongside the prejudice against the Chinese and ethnic minorities? I think this is impossible. Okay. This is impossible because China or Korea, Asian countries, can raise some concerns against all the anti-Asian discrimination in the United States. Okay, do something, US government. Okay, they may ask the US government to do something regarding anti-Asian prejudice and discrimination in the United States. But if the Chinese government does so, the United States government will reply, China, you have human rights issues. Okay, then this is not necessarily a domestic issue. So whenever Asian governments or Chinese governments raises concern about Chinese or Asian American issues, the United States will challenge the human rights issues and other issues in the Asian society and countries. Okay, so therefore, I think there's no answer or no the possibility of the reconciling the United States and China and United States and Asian governments regarding the anti-Black racism and then the anti-Asian racism in the United States. Okay, that's my 2 cents. Okay, that's all I have. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ha. I think in answering the questions posed to you by the organizers, you have asked even more challenging and difficult questions. So we'll see during the Q&A session, whether these questions could be answered. So now we're moving on to our third discussant, Professor Chung, who also had experience of, receiving education and teaching in the United States, particularly in the city of San Francisco. Now he teaches at Vietnam National University. Professor Chung, the floor is yours.
Good evening from my part of the city. It is nighttime, so thank you so much for including me. And I would approach this on a different kind of angle. As an Asian American Studies professor for many years, I have lived in San Francisco, and then I have worked with the various community, and then I also documenting somewhat, the various movement. Sometimes people call it waves, but I don't like to call the word waves, but I call it, Asian movement instead of in kind of including the motion that, we all walk up at the shore and then we, become invaders and all that. And so in the past, there was this kind of a wording, the kind of lexicography that they use against Asian, for example, by looking at movement and all that, kind of situation. So throughout my tenure in the United States, and then following closely, the issues of racism, the issues of anti-Asian, the issues of competition, the issues of, cross-ethnic relation, for example, between, say, Asian and African American, or Asian and Latino American, for example, I will come up with, maybe a couple of angles. One, I would look at labor in the United States, for example, throughout history. And in the past, for example, ever since the first movement of Chinese American who come onto shore into San Francisco and then up to the mountains of California, so-called Gamsan, Golden Hills, for example, then I think, the need for labor put, Asian American into a certain category, in a certain kind of class. And therefore, the many issues that pertaining to labor, is just from the perspective of the white minority, is that we bring them over, we need them, we let them work, they finish the work, and we send them home. And to this particular situation, many of those kind of feelings still remain, and consider us is, some sort of expendable. And that's in the history throughout that. And I think the work of Su Jian Chang, of Lin Chi Huang, of Michael Omi certainly testify to the kind of perspective that they look at Asian immigrant. Then on to, the particular situation, if they view Asian American in a certain way that, be competing with them, taking things away from them, there are legislation also against Asian American. For example, in 1882, Professor Ha had mentioned about the Exclusion Act, and then Professor Brown also mentioned about the 1882 Exclusion Act. It's just because, the labor movement, even the union in San Francisco are trying to forbid, and then to tell that they're taking our jobs, stop them, all right? And then after that, with the Filipino American who came in the 1930s and all that, participating in the labor market, for example, the Filipino are looking at, for example, partnership. And in connection with the community, for example, they love to go out with, the local women, for example. Then another legislation, the anti-miscegenation law forbid the Filipino American to congregate together with white women, or, to approach white women. And then after that, also when the Japanese are working very hard, they moving from the railroad down to the Central Valley and starting to acquiring land in order to work in their farm. So they're accusing the Asian American of taking the land. And so the alien land law came out, and then to say, hey, since you could not be eligible for citizenship, we're going to stop you from buying land. So in all of those kind of situations, the discrimination is that historical thing. It's still there. And then regardless of what, the nice words about people say, a blind collar, and that, you see people in the blind eye, it's still the dormant. And labor is, the situation with the issues currently with, what the Trump administration and those people are whipping up, for example, to say that, right now, because of outsourcing, of taking every, hard labor over the Pacific, and then using Korean, using Chinese, using Vietnamese, using, Bangladeshi to work that. And then these politicians are using that to say, hey, the situation is that because of your jobs being taken away or being shipped over overseas, so therefore you're in this kind of condition. So we see the root cause of discrimination. We see the reason. We see it's all economic, and then mobilized by these very conservative politician to point it out. So in other words, if we look at this thing, how do we going to go about coming up with issues, coming up with some sort of a counterpoint in order to say that, hey, this is the failure of the United States government, that after the Vietnam War, for example, heavy industry was totally taken away. And then instead, moving on to light industry, moving on to, the kind of, very, very small work that, that now you don't need, heavy kind of labor. And so, United States never retrained the people in Middle America. Let's say people in the Rust Belt, let's say people from the Bible Belt, all those people were, completely neglected and not being retrained in order to catch on with the Silicon Valley demands, for example. So at that particular point in time, there was a huge movement of Southeast Asian coming in. At the same time, also people coming out from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and also from South Korea. They occupy this kind of a labor, and this labor, really favors onto the kind of a hard, working ethics of the new Asian immigrant coming in. And so therefore, you see, across the country, Asians are working hard, they're buying homes, they have cars and all that, whereas Middle America is losing out. And when politicians point out and say, hey, you see what's going on? Because those guys were taking your jobs away. So these are the root cause, labor, economy, and all that was the reason, of this kind of thing. And then by the time when Trump come on board, he used it also. And he touched exactly what, Middle America, with people from Indiana, with people from South Dakota, with people from those, Midwest states were waiting for. And so that's why, the whole movement, coupled with the pandemic and the language that many of you have mentioned too, during, using Chinese virus, using Wuhan and all that stuff as to attack furthermore, and then dodging away from the real issue, the issues that how to retrain America, how to retrain the African American, when they used to work in big companies in South LA, to be able to catch on with the reality of the demand of the working world in order for them to do it. So I guess that, my look at that is, one particular aspect of course, you have many more theoretical thing about, how they would view in terms of your own psychology and all that. But I think basically, if I have a job and if I'm losing the job, if I'm not going to, having, the regular meal on my table, then I'm worried and I'm going to listen to something that give me, a simple answer. And that's one of the things that I think, had been, multiplied with the pandemic, and then, getting on to the situation of the current with the anti-Chinese, with the anti-Vietnamese, white people don't know who, you are either a Korean or a Vietnamese or a Thai, they don't distinguish it. And so that's the kind of thing that I think Professor said that it's very hard to really distinguish who is who among Asian American. And so on the other hand, if you look at the Trans-Pacific, to discuss a little bit on Professor Brown, I think, throughout history, if I look at that, there was maybe, very, very little that exchanges between, let's say, America and then in Asia among, the African American, for example. In the case of Vietnam, for example, they were sent there and they would be the front fighters. The white were in the back, but it's always sacrificing the African American. And so you can see that, the interaction or the exchanges or the understanding of each other issue, let's say, throughout Chinese history, for example, being dominated by, Western power, or the slave trade that crossing the Atlantic, not many people in Asia, for example, really understand what's going on. And so therefore, you have to reestablish, you have to redoing something in terms of exchanges, in terms of, of learning, in terms of like the case of, like in San Francisco in the past, in the Bay Area, there was a lot of issue between Korean shop owners and then African-American customers. And so we have some problem of shooting, we have some problem of misunderstanding, but as a way of doing it, the city of San Francisco established the Korean American Community Center, who select a number of African-American teenagers and send them to Korea as to learn and to exchange and to understand the issues. And so I think what we do is we have to get back to the grassroots level of the activism in order to, solve these kind of issues. Theoretical, I think, maybe is good in terms of saying, oh, maybe we should approach this and that. But I think, how do you train? How do you collaborate? And with the grassroots level, the organizing, the community is very important. And I think that's where we can start with from the bottom up, and then from that, at some point, we can have a more of a discussion in terms of how is the policy in the cross-Atlantic or even cross-Pacific. And I think that's maybe my little bit of a sharing with you. And thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor Kong. I think just like Professor Ha's presentation, you have identified more factors and more elements and tension among Asian Americans. But I think that there are questions from the audience and from other discussants. But we're now moving to our fourth discussant, Shaohua Zhan, Associate Professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Shaohua, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Good evening from Singapore. Thanks to Fudan University and the Carter Center for organizing this forum. I'm very excited to be here. I also did my graduate study and received my PhD degree in the United States, and later taught a little while in the United States before I moving to Singapore. Now I'm teaching sociology at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So my comment while engaging previous presentations were based on my experience in the US and also particularly my observation in Singapore. I particularly would like to introduce the situation in Singapore a little bit to have Singapore as a comparative, to provide a kind of a comparative perspective to these racism or anti-Asian crimes in the United States. So during my stay in the United States, I heard episode of discrimination against Asian, but such discrimination not very often will escalate into violence. So this was also shocking to me. In the past 2 years, I heard so many instances of these anti-Asian crimes. I really appreciate Professor Gao and Professor Brown's great insights into recent development and also see the issue from a historical perspective. I particularly resonate with Professor Brown how we should think about building solidarity between Asian and between Black and between also with other minorities. It's interesting. I learned a lot from Professor Gao's survey research. Recently, I also completed a study on Asian immigrants, actually in the US, in Canada, and in Singapore. So that's why I can provide some kind of data. I will show it's very interesting that the data is very similar to what you found in New York City and in the United States. So the project focused on the Chinese and the Indian immigrants in Los Angeles, Vancouver, and Singapore. So in collaboration with researchers at UCLA and University of British Columbia. So my research project was completed, was implemented between 2017 and 2019, so right before the pandemic. So we found in all three cities, the Chinese and the Indian immigrants all reported quite high rates of discrimination. In the US, in Los Angeles, the data very similar to what Professor Gao found in New York City, and it's the proportion is close to between like 55% and 60%. But very interestingly, because we did this comparative study, so we also find quite high rates of anti-Chinese and anti-Indian immigrants, this kind of discrimination. Okay, so very interestingly, this brings the issue to this discrimination or these kind of anti-immigrants. So it not only happened in the Western context, but also happened in non-Western context. Particularly in Singapore, what we found is the Chinese immigrant actually report even higher rate of discrimination than their counterparts in the United States. So it's quite interesting. So one question naturally follow is, So we need to not only to think about the anti-Asian hate or also discrimination from the history, also from the other economic perspective, but also from the perspective of the immigration. Okay, due to immigration, because Singapore is also a major destination for these Asian immigrants. So you'll see these co-ethnic relations or shared minority experience do not always prevent discrimination. So many studies, ours as well, find intra-ethnic discrimination and also the discrimination between minorities. I think several discussants also brought the issue up just now. Okay, so these kind of problems of intra-ethnic discrimination and the minorities, the discrimination between minorities, we also pose challenges to pan-ethnic solidarity as a united front to fight against racial discrimination and also including anti-Asian hate. So that's why the one question I think particularly for Professor Brown is how to think about this solidarity when there is also intra-ethnic discrimination, also the discrimination between the minorities. Okay. So now I would like to talk about Singapore's response to the news about the anti-Asian hate in the United States and elsewhere. Overseas Singaporeans are also subject to this discrimination and hate crimes. So in the last year, the local media in Singapore also has extensively reported the incidents happened to overseas Singaporeans in the United States, in the UK, in the US, and also in Australia. So this actually prompted the local population to rethink their Asian identity and to some extent push Singaporeans also to ally themselves with larger Asian communities in Asia and also the Asian communities in the Western country. So this year is quite there is quite interesting event during this Miss Universe beauty pageant. So the Singaporean content actually use the fashion designs to call for a stop to racist attack on Asians in the United States. Okay. Finally, because I think several several discussants, also Professor Brown and Professor Gao also bring up the issue, how do we solve this problem? I would like to talk a little bit about the experience in Singapore, particularly the government of Singapore's, how the government of Singapore managed these racial relations, which may stimulate our thoughts on possible solutions to promote racial equality. So Singapore has 4 officially designated races or ethnicities, the Chinese, Malays, Indian, and others. So which are commonly known as a CMIO model. So also, although racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination exists in the city-state, such discrimination has almost never spiraled into the violence in the past 4 decades. So this should be at least partly attributed to Singapore's racial harmony policy. So in addition to severe punishment as a deterrence to racial crime, the Singapore government has implemented several measures to ensure racial harmony. I'd like to highlight 2 policies here, which might be interesting to you. So one is ethnic integration housing policy. Most of households in Singapore live in government-built public housing. So the government actually imposed a racial quota on each housing block so that in each neighborhood, so there are 4 races living side by side. So this policy aims to avoid racial segregation. So the racial segregation actually is a common problem in many countries. So this is how, for example, the policy mandates, so each housing block, the proportion of Chinese cannot be higher than 85%. And the proportion of Chinese in Singapore is 74%. So but you cannot be higher than the 85% in almost every housing block. Okay. So the second policy is to support ethnic self-help groups. I think this is resonate with Professor Chuang just point to promote grassroots organizations. So the government support these ethnic self groups And this group provide assistance for their co-ethnics, while at the same time reaching out to other races and establishing joint social programs with self-help organizations for other groups. Singapore, of course, Singapore's racial policy also faces challenges. One challenge is immigration, which is both social discrimination and anti-immigration nativism. The other is increasing racial diversities, which we observed everywhere during the interracial marriages and immigration, which creates hybrid and fluid identities that often go beyond the officially defined 4 races. It remains to be seen how Singapore will tackle this new challenge in the future. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Zhang. I think the last portion of your presentation on how Singaporean government is dealing with ethnic relations is a very good one, particularly on the housing one. You know, for Professor Ha and Professor Zhong and Gao and all of us who are here in the US, we know, you know, de jure discrimination is not there, but de facto, particularly housing segregation in almost all major cities in the US, which is creating this huge problem. Our last discussant, but not the least, is Professor Huang Weifeng from Hangzhou Dianzi University. Professor Huang? You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, first I'd like to say hello to all of the participants in this virtual conference. Second, I'd like to express my thanks to Carter Center and the Fudan Center for American Studies for giving me this opportunity to share views with our academic counterparts, both at home and abroad. And also I'd like to thank the previous presenters and speakers for their informative presentation and speeches. Now because of the limited time, I'd like to focus on 2 of the questions on the agenda. One is about the concept of modern minority, and the other one is about the last question, which reminds me of the loyalty of Chinese Americans. As we know, in the history, Asian Americans are quite similar to other minorities. All of them suffer from racial discrimination, and they are regarded as the other by the white majority. But the fate maybe or the experience of Asian Americans is a little bit different from the experience of Black Americans or other minority groups, in that Black people, for example, were usually regarded as inferior. But for Asian Americans, they it seems that their experience actually has undergone a process of change from the so-called the concept of yellow peril to the concept of, just now I mentioned, modern minority. So, but actually both of these concepts are based on racism. You know, the racism suffered by Asian Americans is much more complicated and subtle, in my opinion. Now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have got another opportunity to look back on the situation of Asian Americans and also other minority groups in the United States. So for a long time, Asian Americans were regarded as a modern minority, but now we see, after the COVID-19 pandemic happened, Asian Americans are again associated with yellow peril. So we can see that both actually the so-called modern minority and the yellow period, okay, are closely connected. So I like to focus on first now. Okay, I like to say something about the negative effects of the concept of modern minority on Asian Americans. I think this concept has negative effects on Asian Americans in three ways. First, it is harmful to Asian Americans themselves. Okay, just now, Dr. Ha mentioned actually the wide-ranging gap between Asian Americans in terms of revenue, right? So actually, as we know, the so-called Asian Americans or Asian American community is characterized by diversity. They have different experience actually. So just now also some other speakers mentioned, for example, the attitude of Korean Americans, right, towards Chinese Americans. So we can see actually from such examples, we can see the difference, or you can say the diversity within the so-called Asian American community. And of course, theoretically, we see that this concept has prevented many Asian Americans from making use of a lot of opportunities to improve themselves because they were regarded as models, right? So maybe they want to give themselves a good image, and also because the government doesn't take the problems of Asians seriously because of the concept of modern minority. And the concept also has not only physical damage, just now I mentioned the physical damage, but also psychological damage. Because of this concept, many Asian American families may have high expectation of their children. And such a kind of high expectation may cause greater pressure to their children. So according to some reports, actually, some young Asian Americans committed suicide because of actually this kind of expectation or because of this concept. And the second harmful effect is that actually this concept covers the unfortunate experience, including racism suffered by Asian Americans. So it seems that all Asian Americans are able to achieve their American dream, but that is not a fact. So actually, we can say just maybe some Asian Americans may be able to achieve their American dream, but actually maybe the majority or a large number of Asian Americans still suffer from various kinds of hardships or kind of bad experience, something like that. So that is the harmful effect to Asian Americans themselves. Now, the concept of modern minority has also negative effects on the relations between Asian Americans and other minority groups, especially I think African American groups because as we know, actually if we look back to the context, the historical context of the concept, it was raised by the mainstream media, right? In contrast with the so-called actually, but by comparing Asian Americans with African Americans, Asian Americans were regarded as hardworking, Black Americans were regarded as lazy, something like that. So this kind of different images actually caused the tension between Asian Americans and African Americans, especially. So in 1992, I think all of you may be familiar with the Los Angeles riot, right? Actually, the cause of the riot was between was because of the conflict between blacks and whites, but the victims of the riot were Asian Americans. So that is an example to show the tension between Asian Americans and African Americans because of the concept of model minority, maybe. And also, as we know, this concept is harmful also to, to American whites, because, in the history, just now I mentioned that the yellow period, Asian Americans were regarded as a threat to American society. And now, under the concept of model minority, actually, some white people are worried, are anxious about the competitiveness, the strong competitiveness of Asian Americans in finding jobs, in education. So the relationship between Asians and Asian Americans and the whites actually are also tense because of the concept, of course, to a certain extent, not completely. So these are the negative effects of the concept of model minority. I just have a few more, maybe 3 more minutes to discuss the last question. Just like I said, the last question reminds me of the question of the loyalty of Chinese Americans to America. As we know, in the history, even today, actually, according to a survey just in 2001, 87% of Americans think that, Asian Americans, no matter how long they have stayed in the United States, actually are more loyal to China than to the United States. So the percentage is very high. So this phenomenon reminds me of what? Of just now, a concept mentioned by Dr. Brown. She mentioned citizenship. So I think even today now, because of the civil rights movement, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and other minority groups have already obtained their legal citizenship. But I think that citizenship has another aspect which may be ignored by a lot of people. That is, in my opinion, I like to describe it as what? As emotional citizenship, emotional aspect of citizenship. So that is to say, in the mind of Americans, Chinese Americans are not recognized, really as Americans. They think that, they are always more loyal to China. So because of this concept, we can often hear reports, read reports about the so-called Chinese American spies for China, such reports. So such reports, and again, now the COVID pandemic 19, again is an example to show us that you can see whenever something bad happens, American people, American government, always try to look for a scapegoat, both internally and externally. Internally, they regard minority groups as scapegoats. Externally, as we know, it's very obvious. They regard China as a scapegoat, right? But they seldom reflect on their own problems. So that is I think so this problem actually reminds me of a topic, a point, idea mentioned by a very famous scholar. That is to say, is it possible to achieve racial integration completely in the United States? So actually, even today, in my opinion, the so-called American people is still in the process of formation or in the process of development, because okay, Asian Americans, Black Americans, okay, are still, not completely, integrated into the society. They are, okay, sometimes whenever, just now I said, something bad happens, okay, they are regarded as alien elements, right? Okay, so that's my point. Okay, thanks for your, attention.
Thanks, Professor Huang. I think your presentation on the concept of model minority and also on the concept of loyalty are very, very important in today's deliberation. Before I turn the moderation to Professor Wu, I just want to share one anecdote from Andy Kim, who is the congressman from the one district in New Jersey. He used to work at the State Department. He said one day, he came back from Iraq and went to the Foggy Bottom, his office. A letter is on the keyboard, and he opened the letter. The letter basically is from the State Department saying, since you are ethnic Korean, you're not allowed to be involved in any discussion or reading any document related to the Korean Peninsula. He shared this with a presentation from the Brookings. He said, my own State Department, after I made so much sacrifice, was telling me because I'm ethnic Korean, therefore I cannot be trusted to deal with those issues. So without me saying anything now, I'm going to turn the moderation to Professor Wu, who unfortunately our time is running out, but still I think we have enough people online to get our speakers and panelists to answer some questions. Professor Wu? You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, well, because of the limit of time, let me just raise two quick questions to Professor Brown and Professor Gao, respectively. For Professor Brown, my question has to do with former President Obama. When he was elected as the first African American as the President of the United States, there was a saying that this shows the improvement of the status of African Americans in the United States. And the Obama presidency will further lift the status of African Americans. But then after that, there is another saying that, well, there may be a backlash to African Americans coming out of the Obama presidency. So as what we saw after him, Donald Trump was elected to the presidency, and there was even stronger anti-African American sentiment in some parts of the U.S. society. So what's your take on this issue? On this question?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think one of the things is that when Obama was elected, the historic election, I think what happened is that people put all the hundreds of years of racial discrimination in this country in the 8 years he was president, the idea that in 8 years we can correct the ways in which racism is functioning in this country, the ways in which it is supported in legal institutions. When we look at the laws, think about how slave laws became Black codes, how those who were originally kind of slave watching societies, those kind of those groups that were used to police slaves actually become the police force. So we think about the ways in which those institutions have long-standing histories. We can't take 8 years and say because we now have an African-American who a person identifies as African-American because he's also in some ways not just a Black president, how we can in some ways use these 8 years to in some ways turn over these issues, not to mention he's president for all of the United States. So again, I'm not able to in some ways, how do we talk about these issues, not just for African-Americans, think about race issues more broadly. So I remember when he was elected, everyone kept saying, well, now America's post-race. And I was like, wait, that is nowhere near accurate at all. And you had a lot of scholarship that was coming out saying, we have a Black president, he's post-race. And I think it was an earmark where people were hoping that his presidency would be the beginning of some changes in terms of institutions, starting from the federal level at the top office, the highest office in the land, and filtering out. But we did not see that. And what happened is, and I still say it's a backlash because that undercurrent was always there. Those individuals who felt in some ways they were not seen, even though their privilege was not in some ways hampered at all. There was no way in which their privilege is taken. But in many cases, we're thinking about race and power and privilege in the United States, it's seen as a zero-sum game. If I have it, I have all of it. It's either 100% or none. An idea of equity and inclusion, sharing some of that, sharing resources and power and wealth is seen as in some ways, if I give you some, or you get some of your own, I give you the opportunity to gain your own access, somehow is taken away from me. And this idea of those who felt in which their privilege and their fragility was taken away. I don't have this opportunity because now we have these initiatives, or the idea of, if we see these initiatives pass, where that means I can't get it. Or even when I was applying for colleges. I remember I went to a family white institution. I remember, I went to football school, and on football weekends, you have people who are coming to campus who are other people who I don't know, but it was just like, asking me randomly, what was your SAT score, as if my presence on this predominantly white campus was some way I was there, and my Blackness meant that someone who, like them, i.e. white, was there if I took their quote unquote spots. So we had these spots. And so I think in many cases, there's a longer conversation. Think, why do we have this idea of spots, who has access and who doesn't, which gets back to the question of thinking about citizenship and access, who has those rights and privileges, and what does that mean in terms of who can in some ways gain? How do we expand the conversation of access? And it goes to one of the questions that was raised about the overall gains of BLM and anti-Asian hate, which is why they have different, some ways, means and motives. I think the overall underlying point is that allowing everyone to exist in their authentic self. And so while they have different, some ways, overall goals, the ability to live and not in some ways be targeted because of how you look or who you are, in some ways is the underlying goal that I think can bring them together.
Okay, my question for Professor Gao is that the current anti-Asian sentiment certainly has been spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic episode. But to what extent this also reflects a broad trend going on in the United States? That means it is true that this country in general has become less inclusive and less open to immigrants. Given your experience of living in the United States in the last 20 years, how do you look at this trend? 2 minutes, okay?
Yes, thank you for the excellent question. I really want to echo what Professor Brown just said, which is all these different movements, different voices that we hear are only to ask everyone, every ethnic racial group to exist as who they are, right? We're not asking for anything extra. We are just asked to exist as our own beings. So I think in that regard, even though there are these movements, there are these tragedies, but I think it's leading to a breakthrough in this society where we say we cannot suffer silently anymore. I think Asian Americans, several of our panelists mentioned, we grew up following this culture of keeping silent and trying to do well and then succeed in this society, but that's not enough. One thing that's been happening during this pandemic is the well-educated, high-income Asians of different ethnicities are also being targeted. It's a wake-up call that it's not that if you do well in school, in your jobs, you will be escaping racism. That's not true. So I think in this regard, it's a positive movement. I think we need to do more to overcome, but I'm hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think to address this chronic issue of racism in the United States with regard to the Asian Americans, first and foremost, I think we need to raise awareness about the contribution of African Americans to the United States. I think there is a kind of lack of appreciation about the contribution made by the Asian Americans throughout history, and also even less awareness about the importance of the future of the U.S. linkage to Asia. We call this today as Trans-Pacific. Actually, I think the future of the United States is as transatlantic as trans-Pacific in terms of economic prosperity and employment. The United States will rely more and more on its ties with the other part of the Pacific. Having said that, I think the government really has an important role to play in this regard. In the last 1 year, we have seen that when some politicians, they want to play the racial cards for their own political purpose, that will certainly fan up the anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. And even today, when the Biden administration, pointed to China as a major strategic competitor and talking about China as a threat to the United States, I just wonder how this will shape the political environment in which the ethnic relations will be managed. So Trump already stepped down, but I don't think this kind of anti-Asian American sentiment is coming to an end. Broadly speaking, I very much worry about the political environment in which Asian Americans will be treated. And in this regard, I agree with Professor Ha that really you cannot tell who is American Chinese, who is American Japanese or Koreans. So in this regard, I think we really need this kind of solidarity among all the Asian Americans, and also working with other ethnic minorities in the United States. We should oppose and condemn all kinds of racism, no matter what the target is. So we are already running out of time. So I want to really thank all the panelists, the two speakers, and 5 discussants for your great contribution. This has been very rich and lively discussion. I look forward to continue our engagement in the future. So thank you all. And also I want to thank the audience who have been with us over the last 2 hours. So thank you all, and have a good day or good night.
Bye-bye.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
Bye.
for the openness, and have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice meeting you all.
Take care.
Bye. Bye. Take care.